Good afternoon. I'm Chris Doherty, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty here at Chestnut Hill College. Welcome to many guests and many other familiar faces here today. It's great to see this turnout. Today's faculty colloquium by Dr. Ryan Murphy, Martyrs of Charity, Philadelphia's Religious Sisters in the 1918 Flu Pandemic. In response to an urgent need for nurses in the fall of 1918 during the influenza pandemic, Philadelphia's Archbishop Dennis Doherty called on religious sisters to leave their ministries and serve as volunteer nurses throughout the city. Despite having little to no medical training, more than 2,000 sisters from various religious communities responded and cared for Philadelphia's sickest patients in field hospitals and in private homes. Our presenter today, Dr. Ryan Murphy, holds a PhD in sociology from Temple University and bachelor's and master's degrees from St. Joseph's University. Ryan has published articles in both sociology and religious studies journals and has presented papers at regional, national, and international conferences. Ryan's main research focus is on women religious and the experience of religious sisters navigating the day-to-day gendered constraints of both secular society and the Catholic Church. Here at Chestnut Hill College, where he has worked since 2005, Ryan teaches sociology courses that focus on structural inequality, and he regularly leads groups through historical tours of the heritage area in the Sisters of St. Joseph Mother House. I've been the beneficiary of 2 of those tours. It's a wonderful experience and wonderful to have you sharing this with us today. Welcome, Ryan. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, all of you, for being here. I look forward to sharing what I believe is a really beautiful story and something that has been lost to history over the years. So I'm grateful that you're with us. So the images and words on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer on September 29th, 1918 are positively exuberant. Recounting the previous day's Liberty Loan Parade down Broad Street, the Inquirer proclaims, "The waiting crowds in the street took up the song, 'The Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming.' And the city might have added a new line for itself, 2 living million strong. The pageant itself was something not to be forgotten. The energies of the city, its wealth, its brawn, its intellect, its patience, its skill in the work of brain or of brawn. These were seen as they had never been seen before, in such a time and under such stress. The city saw the spectacle of an entire city, or as much of it as might be crowded into one thoroughfare, sitting at one time. 200,000 throats made a chorus, of which the echoes might have been heard by the men in the trenches and by the flying Germans over the devastated farms and the broken roadways. At every 100 feet, there was a singing conductor, and at every 100 feet, a speaker when the parade halted." So this parade had been planned for weeks, ostensibly designed to boost morale and drum up patriotism in the city, but also to increase pressure on the city's residents to support the war effort through the sale of Liberty bonds. Despite pleas from area physicians to cancel the parade, wary of a new, particularly virulent strain of influenza creeping into American cities, the celebration went on as scheduled. Philadelphia had been tasked with raising $259 million for the young men fighting in Europe. So then, on Saturday, September 28th, 200,000 Philadelphians crowded Broad Street, unaware of the impending crisis about to ravage their own homes and their streets. Within 3 days, all of Philadelphia's 31 hospitals were at capacity, and the death toll from the influenza began to mount. On October 3rd, health department officials closed schools, theaters, churches, and encouraged residents to isolate if they were ill, and also to wear gauze face masks to limit infections. Over the next few weeks, due to a perfect storm of public health missteps and those ever-present social determinants of health, poverty and racism, Philadelphia found itself in the inglorious position as one of the pandemic's hardest-hit American cities. At the peak of the October 1918 wave, 759 residents died in a single day, with hundreds of thousands becoming ill and nearly 13,000 dying by November. In the face of this unimaginable tragedy, though, emerges a story of courage and humble service that was seemingly forgotten just a few short years later. With doctors and nurses increasingly being called to care for returning service members, and many succumbing to the flu themselves, the American Red Cross put out an urgent call for volunteer nurses. On October 8th, at a meeting between Philadelphia's Archbishop Dennis Doherty and the Mother Superior of the city's non-cloistered religious communities, the Archbishop asked that all available sisters be missioned as emergency nurses, offering them dispensation from their holy rule and permitting them to sleep away from their convents. 2 days later, on October 10th, the Archbishop ordered that all the city's parochial schools and halls be turned into emergency field hospitals. In the ensuing weeks, more than 2,000 religious sisters, which was roughly 2/3 of all women religious in the city at the time, served as nurses in hospitals and in private homes throughout the city. 7 apostolic women's religious communities responded to the Archbishop's call and sent sisters to work in existing hospitals or temporary emergency hospitals throughout the city. Of those, nearly 200 were Sisters of St. Joseph, who cared for more than 600 families in their private homes, cooking, cleaning, and providing comfort and presence to those unable to access medical care in hospitals due to overcrowding or social segregation. Like most accounts of as what has been called variably the Spanish flu or the 1918 flu pandemic, stories of the sisters' service have largely faded from memory, barring a 3-page summary report compiled by Augustinian priest and archivist Father Francis E. Torshire in 1919 for the American Catholic Historical Society of Philadelphia. When the influenza pandemic finally began to recede and the sisters returned to their convents and ministries, letters of appreciation poured in from around the city and the archdiocese, grateful to those congregations who sent sisters to serve during the pandemic's deadliest wave. Hundreds of sisters returned to share harrowing stories of caring for patients in the throes of delirium, fear, sickness, and dozens of sisters would succumb to the disease themselves. So how did this all begin? The first wave of the pandemic struck in the spring of 1918, but went largely unnoticed by Americans who expected yearly outbreaks of influenza. This strain, though, was unlike a previous seasonal strain, or the typical seasonal strain. It attacked its victims relentlessly and with a mortality rate of about 2.5% compared to 0.1% for the seasonal influenza. Most of these deaths resulted from a lethal bacterial pneumonia and other flu-related complications. Epidemiologists estimate that the pandemic's death toll was somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. And if that higher estimate is correct, it would mean that nearly 10% of the world's young adult population was killed by this disease. The flu's origins are still up for debate, with scholars variously theorizing its mutation and emergence in places like Kansas, China, Russia, or somewhere in Western Europe. But regardless of where it originated, the disease quickly picked up the unfortunate misnomer Spanish flu, due to reporting on some of the early cases there, including Spain's King Alphonse XIII. But this was mostly because Spain remained neutral during World War I. This neutrality meant that unlike several other European countries at the time, Spain was not censoring its press or preventing reporting on negative stories that might suppress morale, including those on a new strain of influenza. The virus's second wave hit in the fall of 1918, and this was by far the most devastating and deadly. Certainly a raging war in Europe and soldiers living in cramped quarters provided ample opportunities for quick and effective spread, as did similar densely populated living environments in cities around the world. Infected patients would initially report typical flu symptoms, fever, headache, muscle aches. But in severe cases, this disease would progress into the lungs, causing a particularly lethal form of pneumonia. Reports at the time describe horrifying images of blood spouting from patients' noses, mouths, ears, as if under pressure and soaking their bed sheets, all while these patients gasped for air in agony. In some cases, doctors and nurses write of patients screaming for hours on end, exhibiting signs of delirium and fevers as high as 105 degrees. Another distinguishing factor of this influenza strain was its mortality rate for younger and otherwise healthy individuals. Usually, influenza, the worst outcomes were connected with the very old and the very young, and represented in a U-shaped graph. The 1918 pandemic was consistent with this to an extent, but also showed a shockingly high excess mortality rate among people aged 20 to 40, presenting a mortality graph that looks more like a W. This age group suffered the nearly half of the estimated 675,000 deaths from the pandemic in the United States and contributed to reducing the overall life expectancy in the country by about 12 years. So now some social context. Like most pandemics, the 1918 influenza was indiscriminate in attacking victims across all racial, class, ethnic, and gender lines. Yet this disease also reinforced, and in some cases worsened, existing racial and social inequalities in American society. By 1918, Philadelphia's population grew to more than 1.75 million. Housing was scarce, with families crammed into small apartments and in rooming houses, where laborers often shared beds, alternating sleeping with work shifts. Historian Nancy Bristow writes, quote, "Race and class hierarchies, in turn, shaped the behavior of those who most benefited from them, ensuring that some people in the country suffered not only from influenza, but also the indignities and inequalities of the American caste system," end quote. Patients experienced a spectrum of quality of care along class lines, worsened in the 2 decades prior to the pandemic, when hospitals became increasingly segregated by those who could afford to pay and those who could not. Those age-old conceptions of the deserving and undeserving poor, already deeply entrenched in American society, would also limit the availability of medical care, contributing to victim blaming and further social separation. In fact, Father Torshia writes, in many cases, the sisters found patients suffering more from starvation and neglect than from influenza. So medical doctors and social scientists understood the social and environmental conditions that contributed to negative health outcomes, especially for poor and marginalized communities who were crammed into tenement houses and dilapidated apartment buildings. For instance, in the 3 years preceding the pandemic, there was a noticeable increase in infection rates among Philadelphia's Black population for scarlet fever, typhoid fever, and other respiratory illnesses like whooping cough and tuberculosis. For years, social reformers warned officials about inadequate sewer systems and lack of access to clean water that would inevitably lead to future health crises in the city's most neglected neighborhoods. Yet, public health officials were unable to overcome fiscal and political hurdles to address the larger structural constraints, and instead adopted a policy that emphasized education about germ theory and individual responsibility to protect against disease. In doing so, they effectively reinforced white middle-class beliefs and in turn strengthened their prejudices about unhygienic practices among the poor, among immigrants, and among communities of color. This then shifted the obligation to prevent illness away from society and put it squarely on the shoulders of those who, because of their social conditions, were already most likely to fall victim to the influenza's most rapid spread. Residents of Philadelphia's 7th Ward were particularly at risk due to years of neglect, overcrowding, and segregation. The 7th Ward, which is roughly bounded on the north and south by South Street and Spruce Street, and running east and west from about 7th to 25th Street, was home to the largest percentage of the city's Black residents, and it was also the site where W.E.B. Du Bois conducted his landmark sociological analysis of the Black community nearly 2 decades prior to the pandemic. This study, the first of its kind, pointed to social constraints, specifically the legacies of slavery, racism, and discrimination as primary causes for high rates of poverty, crime, and illiteracy in the Black community. This was in stark contrast to the generally accepted view at the time that these social problems could be explained by Black biological inferiority. So in Philadelphia that fall, just days after the parade down Broad Street, things quickly grew catastrophic. The city's mayor, Thomas B. Smith, was indicted in early September on a conspiracy to commit murder charge, so his energies were mostly spent on his own legal defense, effectively leaving the Board of Health Director, Dr. William Cruzen, alone in crafting and enforcing public health policy. As the number of infected patients overwhelmed hospitals and the dead began to pile up in the streets with morgues at capacity, on October 3rd, the Board of Health closed schools, churches, saloons, and theaters. Residents were encouraged to use handkerchiefs when coughing or sneezing, to avoid crowded public settings, and to wear gauze face masks. Public transit limited the number of passengers in its streetcars, and posters went up reading, "Spitting equals death," and anyone caught spitting on the street could face arrest, at one point totaling 60 persons in one day. In early October, the city's first temporary emergency hospital opened in the Holmesburg neighborhood, with all 500 of its beds filling in one day. Similar staggering numbers occurred at the other 31 temporary hospitals that would spring up in the weeks that followed. By October 6th, Dr. Cruzen announced more than 200,000 cases of influenza in Philadelphia, and within weeks, the city lost all ability to manage the crisis. Infrastructure buckled, city workers called out sick, and nurses began to fall ill themselves, prompting Dr. Cruzen to plead for more help, saying, quote, "If you would ask me the three things Philadelphia most needs to conquer this epidemic, I would tell you nurses, nurses, and yet more nurses," end quote. In his official letter to parishes dated October 10th, Archbishop Doherty offered all church spaces, schools, and halls as emergency hospitals, and responded to Dr. Cruzen's call in granting permission for non-cloistered religious sisters to serve as nurses in hospitals and in private homes. The day before the Archbishop announced this publicly, Mother Mary James Rogers of the Sisters of St. Joseph sent her sisters permission and instructions. "Let us serve God in his poor and afflicted with all reverence. Let no sister go alone. Let them omit the common exercises if necessary. Help as far as is needed with food and other necessities. Our Lord's purse will not fail us. We will do all the praying here that we can. From my heart, I bless you." Mother Mary James then quotes from the Holy Rule, "Be slow not to visit the sick," and offers 10 practical tips, including wearing a face mask when nursing sick patients, and my personal favorite, if you have to change the bedding, you better learn how to do it quick. After the worst of the pandemic had subsided, the Augustinian priest and archivist Father Torcher was determined to document the sisters' work and requested data from the Mother Superior of each congregation who sent sisters to aid in this pandemic. Father Torcher writes that self-advertising is alien to the spirit and the lifelong training of these women of Christian refinement, a feeling also palpable in Mother Mary James's letter to the superiors in the houses dated November 15th, where she says, "We have, I regret to say, been asked to write up the work of the sisters in the late epidemic. Each sister can tell her part, or someone may be appointed to gather for all." She did not want to comply. Dutifully, though, the congregation leaders sent in their stories, and the sisters' reports are equal parts shocking and inspiring. For instance, a Holy Child sister shares, "The sights were often very dreadful when we look back now. In one very poor little home, there were 6 victims, father, mother, and 4 children, in beds in 2 small rooms. In one of these, a dead child had lain for 3 days. It was impossible to get the services of an undertaker." Indeed, as they themselves got sick or simply refused to bury influenza victims, undertakers could not keep up with the demand, and corpses piled up in Philadelphia's homes and streets. The city's only morgue had capacity for 36 bodies, but now held more than 200. Archbishop Doherty pressed dozens of students from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary into service digging graves at 3 Philadelphia cemeteries, including Mount Airy and now Cheltenham's Holy Sepulchre, where an Immaculate Heart of Mary Sisters and Sisters of St. Joseph prepared meals and served the seminarians for 5 weeks that fall. For the most part, though, the sisters served as nurses with almost no medical training and under limited supervision from professional doctors and nurses. The Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur reported, "The sisters did not have to be told what to be done. They saw what was needed and did it quietly and promptly." Despite their lack of authority in both the hospital and in the Catholic Church, the sisters were decisive in commanding under pressure. The same report from the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur continues. "We were told a poor man was dying. We went to him and found a minister by his bed. The patient asked for a priest. A sister then went to call the priest, but the minister said, 'There's no use in calling a priest. This man has been a drunkard, and it's too late for him now to turn to the Lord.' Sister replied, 'The priest was ordained for the sake of sinners, and our Lord has given him power to forgive all kinds of sin.' The priest came at 10 p.m. and administered those last sacraments." The reports from the congregations that submitted reports give bleak accounts of caring for patients of all ages and in various states of illness, with sisters, again, cooking, cleaning, changing bed sheets, and importantly, accompanying the dying in their preparation for death with Sacred Heart badges and prayers of contrition. One Immaculate Heart of Mary sister remembered, "Each night was a repetition of the previous one, bathing the sick, distributing medicines, giving nourishment, and preparing the dead for the morgue. This continued for 2 weeks when at last the plague was under control, and we returned to our convent with memories of an experience which will remain with us as long as we live." Other communities went out to private homes and cared for sick patients who could not access traditional medical care, including 186 Sisters of St. Joseph, the largest number of any community in the city that was doing this type of work. Many of these sisters offered stories of finding infants and young children unclean or unfed, while a parent or another family member was in the other room, either too sick to care for them or in some cases had already died. The sisters would nurse who they could back to health and find suitable care and resources for the families before moving on to repeat this depressing episode in the next home. Despite formidable social barriers, sisters from participating congregations tended to patients regardless of their racial, ethnic, or religious backgrounds. An IHM sister sent to serve as a nurse in the city's charity hospital, Blockley, in West Philadelphia, remembers, "There were about 25 men in each ward and adjoining shack. Most of these men who had come to Philadelphia to work in ammunition plants, and generally they had been living in one rented room. They were lying there with the dirt of their work still on their hands and on their faces. Many of them had not received attention since their entrance. The reason for this, of course, evident: overcrowded conditions. Their gratitude for any attention from us was really touching. We had been told that we might expect any kind or class at Blockley, and this was verified. We had in our wards Greeks, Italians, Jews, Armenians, Black Americans, Poles, and even East Indians. They were all God's sick children, and I loved them." Unsurprisingly, it was the city's black residents, especially those in the 7th Ward, who suffered the worst living conditions, the product of decades of cumulative structural disadvantage and explicit racism. When the Board of Health opened the emergency clinics and pandemic hospitals, those were restricted to white residents only, leaving black patients with no viable medical options. Though the black population had always dealt with menacing health inequalities, these disparities were brought into stark relief during this pandemic. 19th and early 20th century racist conceptions of black biological inferiority were rampant, which of course fueled more racial fears and further segregation. When Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital, one of the city's only 2 hospitals for black patients, filled its 75 beds to capacity, hospital doctor Dr. Nathan Francis Mosel opened an emergency clinic a few blocks away at one of the only black Catholic schools in the city, St. Peter Claver School at 12th and Lombard. There, Mother Catherine Drexel recalls Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament splitting their time caring for flu patients in the municipal hospital in the annex of the school, and in private homes and in the surrounding neighborhood. In many cases, Philadelphia's women religious provided the only medical care and dignity to the city's poor, Black, and immigrant communities. Given the realities of the rigid racial and social segregation at the time, the care that these sisters provided for the Black community in particular cannot be overstated. So by the end of October, the influenza case rate mercifully began to slow, and deaths soon followed. Health Commissioner Dr. Cruzen began to lift bans and other mandates put in place to control the pandemic. On October 27th, churches and synagogues could hold services again, and Philadelphia's public schools reopened on Monday, October 28th, after what the Inquirer called the longest enforced vacation known in the school system of Philadelphia. The city's parochial schools would open a week later because, of course, all the sisters who were teaching in them were out nursing. As the city began to resume its normal activities, the sisters returned to their convents and traditional ministries, encouraged by congregational superiors to adopt a posture of silence and prayerful discretion when speaking about these harrowing experiences in treating flu patients. In fact, after Dr. Cruzen told the press that he wished to honor St. Joseph's sister, Sister Mary Gerard, Mother Mary James Rogers sent him a letter the next day basically saying, "Thanks, but no thanks." As you can see here, Mother Mary James reminded Dr. Cruzen that sisters took on the work to serve God and God's people, not for public recognition. And interestingly, Sister Mary Gerard, who he wished to honor, was a head nurse over at the convent for many years, supervising in the infirmary and the surgery ward that was there. So letters of support and gratitude arrived from all over the city, from those who the sisters served, and many recounted touching stories from those who were previously hostile to Catholics. One sister remembers, "One man said to me, 'Sister, God must have sent me here to change my opinion of you Catholic ladies. I hated Catholics before this epidemic. Now I shall revere the name of the Catholic sisterhoods and defend them all my life. You good ladies came here to nurse us at the risk of your own lives, and I have learned my lesson. God bless you.'" Another remembers when she and 5 sisters were traveling by train to their convent on the way home from one of the emergency hospitals. "Now, to find where the hospital is, we inquired from the car conductors, who were most kind to us when they learned that we were there to care for the sick. One gentleman in the car paid for our fares and then said in a loud voice for the benefit of all in the streetcar, 'Now, what would Philadelphia do if not for these good women?'" In all, nearly 24 sisters died while serving during the pandemic, including 7 sisters of St. Joseph. And if you'll pardon my really horrible cell phone pictures, but all 7 of these sisters are buried behind Fitzsimmons Hall on our campus. Of these 7, only 1 was over the age of 30, and 3 of the sisters professed their final vows on their deathbed. All 7, as I mentioned, are buried behind Fitzsimmons Hall. And in a letter of condolence and gratitude, Mother Mary James Rogers received from the Archbishop John McCourt, honoring these sisters' ultimate sacrifice. And Bishop McCourt writes, "He who has taken from you so many young helpers full of promise will not fail to send others to take their places. When history of these sad days shall be written, it will contain no more glorious chapter than the one that will record the heroic devotion of the Sisters of St. Joseph. And in the years to come, your sisters will find inspiration and joy in recalling the unflinching devotion, the spirit worthy of the martyrs, the heroism born of the love of Christ of the members of the community. I congratulate you, dear Mother, that your whole community has given such glorious evidence of Christian charity, and I am sharing your sorrow that these holy religious have been taken home." Congregational historian and a name very familiar to those of us at the college, Sister Maria Kostka-Logue, contends that these words prove prophetic as vocations increased dramatically in the decade following the pandemic, allowing the community to grow teaching staff in its schools and to open new ministries throughout the city, not the least of which was Chestnut Hill College, incidentally. Notable here is Bishop McCourt calling the deceased sisters martyrs, a term that quickly fell into fashion during the pandemic as survivors tried to make sense of the countless tragic deaths, giving them greater meaning, likening these deaths to those fighting on the battlefields of Europe. In the wake of the pandemic's overwhelming fall wave of illness and death in Philadelphia, the sisters' work caring for the most vulnerable and marginalized shines as one of very few bright spots. Philadelphia's Mayor Smith, who was recently acquitted of those charges against him, lauded the sisters' service in a letter to the Archbishop, saying, "Our call for help not only received ready and prompt response on part of the Archbishop, but the help and assistance at once offered by His Grace and the nuns were of the kind that was immediately effective. The prompt opening of those buildings within the jurisdiction of the Archbishop as emergency hospitals, and the equipment of them placed at our disposal facilities, which we needed so urgently, and which beyond any doubt resulted in the saving of innumerable lives. I have never seen a greater demonstration of real charity or self-sacrifice than has been given by the sisters in their nursing of the sick, irrespective of the creed or color of the victims, whenever the nuns were sent. I look upon the services rendered by the Archbishop and the nuns as one of the most potent aids in making headway we have toward gaining control of the pandemic." Soon as the pandemic simmered and eventually settled into a mutated, less deadly seasonal strain, it became less and less a part of people's daily lives. With the dead no longer piled up in the streets and people resuming their pre-pandemic activities, the tragedy of those 12 weeks in the fall of 1918 began to fade from collective memory. Literature scholars write that the pandemic is largely ignored in literature of the 1920s and 1930s, a cultural amnesia that flu historian John Barry attributes to human reluctance to write about what he calls, quote, "the horrors that nature inflicts upon people, the horrors that make humans least significant," end quote. If not for the congregation's meticulous notes chronicling the sisters' day-to-day activities and Father Torscher's persistence in recording each community service and sacrifice, it's likely that we would never know the names of these sisters and the work that they did. Despite a reluctance to acknowledge the pandemic throughout the 20th century, Philadelphians would periodically recall the legacy of religious sisters who served as volunteer nurses. In one account, years later, a sister of St. Joseph experienced this sincere appreciation when she asked her doctor about the bill after a medical procedure at Einstein Hospital. Sister remembers, quote, "He looked at me and said, 'Sister, you paid your bill long ago during the epidemic of 1918. The city and its Jewish community, especially in this hospital, can never repay sisters for all that they did.'" Well, I'm grateful for all of your time and attention, and thank you for being here.